Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Quite a difficult one to follow, I should say. So my name's Gully Burns. I'm working at USC, and we're going to take a slight change of tack by discussing a subject that we haven't really covered before, which is systems-level neuroscience. And just to give you a quick introduction to the kind of problems and the kind of domain that we're looking at, and this is not unique to neuroscience whatsoever, pretty much any physiological or medical study has the same kind of multi-level approach, but it's something that's very present in neuroscience. This is taken from a classic textbook by Gordon Shepherd, which shows the various different levels, ranging from behavior at the whole animal through systems such as the visual system, the auditory system, the limbic system, these various different parts of the brain that are combined to produce effects at that level, all the way down through to genetics. And one of the things that neuroscientists have to do when they work at any one of these disciplines is to somehow combine their knowledge with other levels as well. Now, I'll master this eventually. So within, and one of the things that neuroscientists have to deal with is that at this level, from the whole animal through system down to probably at the level of the whole cell, the information that they have to deal with is scattered throughout the literature, and we'll get into this, and isn't really available in a formal way. And, but there are some ontologies, some formal approaches and representations of neuroscientific work that do exist. Foremost among those is, we've heard it a couple of times today, the gene ontology actually deals with concepts, individual terms that are located pretty much at every level of this hierarchy, but they emphasize very much the usage of these terms for genetics. The UMLS is the Universal Medical Language System, which is put forward by the which is a very large project put forward by the National Library of Medicine. This has been around for a long time, and equally deals with things across all levels. But these are both simply concept maps or term-based ontologies, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the future. One thing that's particularly interesting is at the level of the brain region, there is some formalization in the form of atlases. And one of the things that's kind of interesting to illustrate at this point is that the terminology of different brain regions is hideously complicated. I mean, this is a particular favorite of mine. The paragigantocellular reticular nucleus, lateral part, has the synonyms A1, C1, rostral ventrolateral medulla, and ventrolateral medulla as well. All of which I've heard used in various different scientific talks throughout when I'm just in the lab listening to my colleagues discuss these things. And of course, then we have the formalization at the lowest level of molecular signaling and genetics with databases such as KEGG and NCBI that we've discussed already, which are massive and quite... this is the kind of problem that I would say most of you are familiar with in terms of having to scale up data resources and having to try and deal with huge amounts of information. Now, the interesting thing about neuroscience is that these formalization representations are not really used by people in the field. A bench neuroscientist may have heard of Go, may not have heard of Go. Will probably have heard of UMLS, but almost certainly doesn't use these things. This is, of course, at the upper levels of this framework. At the lower levels, you bet, they're using KEGG and NCBI all the time. But they're not necessarily using these things. And they're actually using the terminology within brain regions. But it's interesting that I work in a neuroanatomy lab. And when we go over papers in journal clubs and such like, talking about physiology and such like, more often than not, they don't even use an atlas, let alone a formal representation of the nomenclature. And this is a standard thing. So, and we'll actually get to why it is that systems-level neuroscientists don't really formalize their approaches in a second. So, what are we talking about when we talk about the neuroscience community? This is actually, funnily enough, this is the Society for Neuroscience's annual meeting in 1999, I think. And this is actually taken from, this is the conference hall in the conference center at New Orleans, which was recently involved in that horrible situation. And this is 1/4 of the room. There is actually, behind me and to both sides, there are equal numbers of posters where people are presenting these things. And why do I show this? Well, it's interesting because each one of these posters is a presentation, and the people down here almost certainly are not really talking to the people up here, even though they're probably talking about this, they're talking about the same subject, they're talking about the same framework, they're talking about probably the same data, and they would be able to talk to one another, but they don't do so because the infrastructure to actually facilitate that communication doesn't exist. So the community of neuroscientists is currently probably about 50,000. There was about 34,000 attendees for this for last year's Society for Neuroscience meeting. And most of these guys are non-computational. They use their desktop computers to perform with Excel and Word and other MATLAB and these kind of desktop applications, but they're not really consumers of a large-scale infrastructure at the present time. But having said that, they're hungry for neuroinformatics solutions. If you look at the Neuroscience Database Gateway, which is a page which is run by the Society for Neuroscience, there are about 100 databases online. And if you scan through them, they're at various different levels of maturity and various different levels of usefulness. So the community recognizes within the official infrastructure that these things are important, but it's still early days yet within the development cycle here. And the most important criteria that I can say that I've noticed here is that neuroscientists have a very little time to discover new things and to work with new approaches that forces them to reevaluate how they work already. Anything we do has to fit into their work cycle immediately with as little relearning of things as possible. That's just a truism. So I love this picture because it sums up pretty much the problem that most neuroscientists encounter when they face the literature. And it's interesting as well that we've discussed that the literature has been mentioned a couple of times in previous talks as an entity, and it is to a certain extent a kind of seamless mass of documents that you have to extract information from, read the papers by hand, and think about them for a long time before you can actually get the information out. And the kind of focus of this presentation, the punchline of this presentation for what I'm actually interested in trying to do is to provide a way of actually getting inside the publications and making that information more accessible and easy to understand for informatics solutions to be able to actually operate from. And I talk about the kind of existing infrastructure for information in neuroscience as being the literature. It also exists in a non-official form as things like lab notebooks, data files, figures and diagrams, posters, and of course PowerPoint slides such as this one, and presentations, web pages and movies. And it's interesting that within the publication framework that we have within the subject, you'll spend about 30 hours building one of those posters that you showed at a conference. And once you've stuck it up on the wall and stood in front of it for 3 hours and talked to people, you take it down and it's never seen again. So all that work is actually wasted. There's no archival mechanism for keeping track of posters at conferences. Just an interesting observation that I think we could be missing out on a very large resource that could actually provide a lot of use for people. So I'm going to go back to the whole question of ontologies, and within term-based ontologies that we are referring to. If you have a representation, so what is an ontology? It's a specification of a conceptualization. That's one way of expressing what it is. And you could look at it from a kind of three-level system. If you have your conceptual model at the top, that would normally talk about things like stress, energy balance, homeostasis, and glucoprivation. These are all terms that you might find in Go, in the gene ontology. Now, most neuroscientists who are actually working in this field do not really deal with these terms. They use them they use them to enter the keywords for their papers when they're being submitted to a journal, but other than that, they don't really operate here. What they operate in is when they're assaying for these various different items and terminology using quite complicated and precise methods. So they define their model system, and then they perform experiments to actually make measurements on that model system. And forgive me if this is kind of cryptic and difficult to understand. basically, and I work in a lab where they do these things routinely. What they're looking for is they inject a chemical into the animal's body that called 2-deoxyglucose, which causes a stress response in the animal. And then they look for the expression of these molecules, MAPK and PERK, in specific regions in the brain. And this is the kind of terminology that's actually being used within the science. And the important distinction is that here you have terms, here you have your independent variables that determine the structure of the experiment and basically how you are asking your question, and here are the answers that you get in the form of the dependent variables. And of course, you'll notice that the things up here are imprecise, and the things down here are precise. And at the moment, the only things that are being represented in those large-scale ontologies, I would claim, are these terms which are imprecise. So it's no wonder, therefore, that people are not using, that people who are actually working in the field are not using these ontologies. So that's a somewhat bold statement, but there you go. So how do scientists construct an argument? Now, this is a kind of format of a slide that I've seen so many times in neuroscience talks, I can't even say. You'll have a statement of some fact or some observation or some hypothesis that's been tested as the title of the slide, and then you have experimental data supporting the statement. Now, this is just a template. This is just a kind of an informal template for one way to represent a scientific argument. And it's actually practically executed by scientists performing this work all the time. And just bear that in mind while we actually get to the solution that I'll be presenting in a very short moment. So in other words, when we actually are talking about a knowledge solution, the requirements are that neuroscientists basically have to try and remember a large number of these statements. Just imagine if your discipline involves remembering 30 statements for a specific scientific argument, and you have to, and they're all natural language, and you basically have to evaluate them and place them into your mindset in order to try and work out anything. You then have to synthesize those statements into a personal understanding of the subject, and then you have to interrelate your models that you come up with intuitively with other people's models, so that you both gain an understanding of how things work. And the whole point is that NeuroScholar, the system that I'm demonstrating today, is actually designed to provide support for this. It's an interesting truism that I was attending the birthday party in the lab of Richard Thompson, who's a very high-ranking senior biologist at USC, who was 75 this year. And Larry Swanson, who's an equally eminent scientist, said, it's interesting that biologists only really become very great when after the age of about 55 or 60. And why is that? It's because they've had to be steeped in the kind of lore and understanding of their subject for that long to be able to know enough to be able to then really evaluate the subject as a whole. Now, whether or not you believe that, I'm not sure, but that kind of like upset me because it means that I don't really want to have to wait that long to be able to get all that information. So, and also, this whole approach, this whole idea, is the kind of way in which we're doing this is a sneaky way of introducing formalization into this subject. So basically, by introducing a software package to actually take care of a lot of these issues, I am, through the back door, trying to create an environment where we are introducing formalization into a subject which otherwise is not formal. So, okay. So how does NeuroScholar work? Actually, we'll start talking about the software project. You have a bunch of different papers representing a disparate source of information. You take one paper, and then you basically can extract out individual facts from that paper as the form of fragments that we're calling. You then can interpret those fragments and superimpose knowledge structure on top of those, and then interrelate those different fragments using the software tool as it stands. So, and all of this basic representation is a conceptual representation of what NeuroScholar is. So this is what the software looks like. We've actually spent a little bit of time trying to make this look like a web browser, quite simply because neuroscientists, like everybody else on the planet, use web browsers all the time. So we've included forward and back functionality. And this is our current release. This is an actual working system that you can download from neuroscholar.org at any time. It's a Java application. You basically, and each one of these links is a link to a knowledge base on the actual system that you're running the application on. You click on one of these things, and you are then taken to a knowledge base that contains a number of different views, a number of different data items that represent quite complex data structures within the knowledge base. So, for example, you probably can't read this, but and each one of these is divided into different packages. So you have experiment, knowledge statement, model, and you also have relations between different different views that can be used to create edges that create relationships between the items. So let's just click through a little bit. This is, as you can see from the previous slide, you click on this button, you actually get a graph representation of the schema. And this illustrates the kind of design of the system quite nicely. At the center, you have this idea called a knowledge statement. You remember the piece of text just above the graph that represents what the graph is trying to say. This is the central item of importance to the knowledge base. And hanging from it are experiments, fragments, and models, all of which are different types of knowledge statement. A fragment is an interesting type of knowledge statement because it's basically information that exists outside of the system that we are taking a snapshot of and bringing in and representing locally within the NeuroScholar knowledge base. Experiments are our representations of those fragments made up of a number of fragments to actually create a local representation of that information. And then models are interpretations based upon that. This is basically what a fragment looks like. We have a tool, so within the application, you load up a PDF file, and then when you want to create a fragment in that PDF file, you're taken into an editor, a viewer, I should say, and you're able to create these kind of polygons where you can actually delineate clearly within a text a paragraph or a sentence or an item individually. Now, in the same way that previous speakers have actually been talking about being able to annotate and curate individualized databases for a specific subject, this is our methodology for doing the same thing, based upon a whole bunch of PDF files. Now, this may not seem like much, but in itself, I think that this is a radical departure from previous treatments of the literature. Because what we're trying to do, instead of having a reference, so when you have a fact in a paper that refers to another paper, normally that's just referring to the whole thing. What we're talking about is actually referring to a small section of that paper that allows you to construct a specific argument that actually is so you have a statement in one paper that refers to this fragment or a collection of these fragments. It is actually, rather than talking about the resources that contain the facts, we're trying to talk about the facts themselves. So I view this, even though it's a very small point from a technical perspective, it's an important one to make from a scientific one. We're also interested in trying to use the same framework for representing data in notebooks, where our level of sophistication is simply that we scan pages or we take image files and we put them into an archive, and then you're able to annotate and superimpose annotations on top of those individual files within your local archive. The kind of annotations that we want to be able to allow are textual and also voice annotations. So in other words, if you're discussing a specific paper with a colleague, you can actually record your voice and save this to be looked at a later stage. The graph-based representation that we have here allows you to see all the links and the various different connections between the different items within the knowledge base. So that's and this kind of representation is an accurate depiction of the contents of the knowledge base. But unfortunately, as soon as it gets kind of, as soon as you enter more than 5 or 6 items here, it gets very complicated. So we also allow the knowledge base users to hide it and then navigate via links superimposed in the current page. Other kinds of annotations that you can create. Actually, I'm just going to check time. So how much time do I have, Dan? 5 minutes, okay. So we have the capability of actually putting attribute value pairs into superimposed over fragments as well. Now, this is obviously, this allows scientists, when they're entering data for their fragments, to actually create indexes that they can then search at a subsequent time, or summarize at a later time, so that they can then see what the contents of the knowledge base is. So, for example, if a neuroscientist is surveying the literature for a specific fact, he can actually compile a study which is in an electronic form and then can go back to it at a later stage. So that's pretty cool. I'm actually just going to skip through this. This is an example of a fairly complex data representation that is used to track connections in the brain. And essentially what we do is we have in our interpretation, we have a representation of experiments that actually allows us to infer the final interpretation. And then we base our representation of experiments on fragments derived from our resources. The actual representation that we have for tract-tracing studies is derived and is represented here. I'm afraid, I'm sorry, it's a little complicated. The idea is that you have a knowledge statement, which is actually an experiment. So an experiment is, we made an injection of a specific tracer into this area, and we found labeling, we found transported labeling in this area. That's a statement that is represented in this framework, and we actually have tools here that I'll show you in a second that allow you to visualize the exact location of each of the different components. So it's not just a simple textual statement, the actual data is represented within this format as well. And there's a whole bunch of objects on so each of the green arrows is an inheritance relationship, and the red arrows is a dependency relationship. So we're actually trying to formalize the representation and present it in a graphical form in this framework as well. Entering data in this framework is somewhat difficult. If you can imagine actually trying to deal with, getting a neuroscientist to deal with a schema of this complexity, that's not going to happen. So what we do is we actually, we have a questionnaire mechanism. So the user can simply enter the data for the knowledge base by following a series of 4 questions. What kind of injection are you making into the brain? Where did you make that injection? Where did you find labeling? And what kind of tracer is it? Now, and we do that, we do that within a questionnaire that allows you to guide, so that the neuroscientist is guided in the way in which they enter data. And these controls are actually quite complicated. You can delineate, you can select items from a list, or you can delineate regions in a brain atlas application that I'm just about to show you. So when you've done all of this, you have your resource, your publication here, with all the different associated items to describe it. You have fragments contained within the publication, and then once you've actually run your data capture analysis based upon your questionnaire, you get your representation of actual real data within the knowledge base in this form, which is a representation of a connection. On the right-hand side, you see a plugin application, which is called NeuARt, which is something we've devised as well, which is a neuroanatomical atlas, a mapping atlas, that allows you to actually see data plotted in the context of space. You can't really see it very well, but there are fibers here, which have been drawn painstakingly by the neuroscientists who are performing this experiment. The actual NeuARt system itself, you can see here, I think, basically is a representation for this kind of data. Each one of these slices is a coronal slice through the brain, taking the different levels, shown at the top here. We're actually showing one level in a published brain atlas. And what this allows you to do is to represent data from here 6 different experiments superimposed onto one another so that you can visualize them. The tool allows you to zoom in so you can see in more detail. All the different colors represent the different types of experiment. And you can actually show 2 panels at once, which is extremely useful for neuroscientists. This is a feature that they've asked for, so that they can actually compare different labeling patterns across levels. The software engineering involved in this, I won't go into very much. We basically use something called the View Primitive Data Model Framework, which I wrote, which is simply a scripting approach to taking a UML diagram with a set of specification files that allows you to build the knowledge base and the Java user interface automatically for that specific schema. So in other words, the kind of designs that you're seeing here are the framework, the software framework that you're looking at is a general one and can be instantiated in pretty much any design that you want to work with. We built a JUnit testing system to make sure that the system was working for all the various different database interactions required for that, so you can run through a series of tests to make it work effectively. The system is open source. You can download it from SourceForge. And it's available as an installer from NeuroScholar. So it's a one-click install. You basically download the file, you click Go, and it will install itself on your hard drive. Where we're going to go with this in the future, basically what I would really like to do is to try and, instead of have these complex, essentially object-oriented designs for the knowledge representations, what I would like to do is to try and capture the logic used by neuroscientists when they're designing their experiments. Because it's not random. They're choosing these things for a very specific reason, and there's a logic to them. But the thing is, our representation here doesn't capture that. And I think that would be a very interesting thing. The other thing, of course, is that the whole field of natural language processing is dealing with textual information that can be found in the literature on a computational scale. And I'm collaborating with Edward Hovey at ISI, the Information Sciences Institute in Los Angeles and Marina del Rey. And we're looking at a corpus of texts that is taken from this journal, the Journal of Comparative Neurology. And we've actually downloaded roughly 12,000 papers, and which comprises about 100 million words. And this is forming the basic corpus for us to try and automate some of the processes of acquiring, of diving into these papers and actually being able to extract concepts and these data structures from within it. Acknowledgements, I'd like to, this work was funded primarily by the National Library of Medicine for an R01 grant over the last 5 years. We enjoyed, before then we enjoyed funding from NSF and from the Human Brain Project. I'm very lucky to have the opportunity to work with Arshad Khan, Alan Watson, Larry Swanson, and the members of their lab. Shahram Gandahandarazadeh has been a colleague who's been supporting this project right from the start, including other members of the computer science community. And various different student developers and other people have also contributed to this. So thank you for your time. Do you have any questions? Sorry, could you repeat the question? The OR, object relational. Well, I'm sorry, again, I'm not sure what the question was. Right, right. Well, we basically devised this approach ourselves, and we looked at various different alternatives to try and model the system. And basically, it seemed that UML was the most straightforward and easy representation for us to manipulate and use, just to be able to actually represent the various different components that we wanted to. One of the things that I've noticed with other methodologies is that it was harder to encapsulate multiple items into one thing. For example, when you are building a protege ontology, for example, you have a lot of different classes, and each one of those classes represents a thing within your knowledge base. Now, what we were looking for was a composite object, such as, for example, an article within the knowledge base has authors as a component within it, but you also want authors to be a separate thing within the database as well. So that probably doesn't answer your question, but that's the kind of rationale that we approached this with. In terms of like English and French and... Right. Well, I think the question relates to how you would use the term ontology. Because, I mean, the way in which ontology is kind of represented within this system is that it's simply, it's a specification of a conceptualization. It's how you're trying to specify what you're thinking about. It's not necessarily linguistic in its nature. It's more computational. So it's related to the kind of data schema that you have, but also the semantic meaning of the interactions between the different concepts. So, I'm not sure if I'm answering your question correctly, but I think that, I mean, we're trying to address, basically we're trying to solve problems by providing software tools. That's really the kind of question, the way in which we're addressing this kind of issue. So there's a question over here. Sorry. None of it. It's just, the interesting thing about that I hope is our saving grace, is that neuroscientists at the moment have to read the papers anyway. And I've actually spoken to a number of my colleagues, and it's a great thing that basically they have to read the papers and they have to study them. And they will make notes in whatever format they do and then go away and forget the notes completely. So they see the utility in actually having a formal structure, a formal representation of this system already in place so that they can go back and actually see it. Now, what I'm shooting for is a process of semi-automation based on the natural language processing that we're trying to do to facilitate and help the data entry process without fully automating it. Right.
That might be a way to semi-automate parts of it, or as a baseline for an experiment. Try something like one of those NeuARt techniques.
Absolutely.
And compare that to what humans can do. Maybe there's an interesting experiment.
Absolutely, yes. I would completely agree.
Where you record the voice, which is, I can think about some of the things I say about papers I read. I don't know if I'm...
Would you want to record it, yeah? Right. All right, one more question.
After this profession in the UK, where we've been funding a couple of similar projects to your interesting project, but in chemistry and bioinformatics rather than neuroscience.
Right.
So they've been using tablets and things to do electronic verticals. And they found using semantic web technologies like RDF
Right.
an interesting way to use it. I mean, you can do RDF in XML with X-links, but they find RDF is easier to link to URIs and all this sort of stuff.
Absolutely.
Yes,
well, the interesting thing is this project is now 5 years old, or 4.5 years old, and RDF didn't exist when we were building the basic infrastructure. So what we've done is actually this is all built on top of a relational database architecture, and we have a system that works and that is scalable. So the way in which we're addressing that kind of question is it's actually completely simple to build semantic web interoperability between this and everything else. No. We did. We looked at it quite extensively, and I think that the next phase of the project will actually have an OWL component built in. And I think OWL is very interesting as a representational language because they do deal with a lot of the concepts that come up when you're building these schema and interrelationships between things. So yes. Great. You're welcome.